Hey everyone! Tonight we explore the secret realm hidden behind the walls of convents, where holiness and purity were preached, but not always followed. While the Middle Ages gifted us with magnificent cathedrals and holy manuscripts, they also left behind court files, confessions, and letters that uncover a much less virtuous aspect of medieval nuns. This includes secret romances, concealed pregnancies, escape routes, and even wild gatherings disguised as spiritual bliss. Before settling in, take a second to like this video and subscribe if you truly appreciate my content. Share in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is for you. It is always intriguing to see who is joining from across the globe. Now, lower the lights, perhaps switch on a fan for a gentle background noise, and let us slowly dive into tonight's adventure together. When a woman chose to enter a medieval convent, she was expected to abandon the outside world completely. Along with her dresses, jewelry, and family name, she surrendered the right to any physical affection forever. Theoretically, she became a bride of Christ. However, in reality, this spiritual union was often flexible. The promise of chastity was meant to be taken seriously. No touching, no flirting, absolutely no secret meetings at midnight in the cloister garden with Brother Jack from the nearby hill. But as any knowledgeable historian or a bishop complaining of a headache will agree, vows are only as binding as the determination to abide by them. In numerous convents, this determination showed some flexibility. For certain nuns, the commitment to chastity was more of a guideline than an absolute rule. After all, when confined behind stone walls for decades, surrounded only by women, and the occasional suspiciously attractive confessor, boundaries could become unclear, very unclear. Some found inventive ways around it. There were discreet debates suggesting that affection did not matter if it lacked intent. Others found comfort in spiritual loopholes. If Christ was regarded as your divine spouse, then who could oppose a touch of passion, whether mystical or otherwise, especially if it was documented in Latin? Reports from church inspectors sent to verify that all was pure and devout often included tactful complaints like excessive closeness among the sisters or male visitors wandering alone in the orchard. In other words, someone was misbehaving, likely near the apple trees. Then came the convents that functioned more like elite boarding schools. Wealthy families sent their rebellious daughters with the clear understanding that someone else would handle their abundant energy. Some convents made an effort. Others simply shrugged and prayed the bishop would not visit too frequently. Naturally, not every nun strayed. Many led truly devoted lives, filled with prayer, study, and baking bread that could dent a helmet. But others, let's just say, approached the vow of chastity the way people today approach unlimited breadsticks. Indeed, chastity was firmly established, solemnly pledged before God, and carefully woven into the convent's regulations. Yet behind those silent walls, the rules were sometimes quietly altered. Pregnancy was notoriously hard to dismiss, especially for a nun. While it was possible to smuggle in a secret lover or a wheel of illicit cheese, a growing belly was far more difficult to hide beneath the habit. Explaining such a condition without involving at least one individual, multiple sins, and sometimes even a bewildered donkey was a challenge. Medieval convents were expected to be bastions of purity, but the facts often told a different story. Church documents, complaints from bishops, and distressed accounts from abbesses all point to one undeniable reality. Nuns were, without question, becoming pregnant. The pregnancies were not theoretical or symbolic, but actual, physical, and inconvenient. The explanations given frequently displayed remarkable inventiveness. Some insisted it was demonic possession. Others claimed miraculous conception, which, although biblically plausible, was met with doubt when the event occurred 3 towns away and included Brother Jack, the choir director. One nun even stated she fell on a man, an excuse difficult to refute given the force of gravity. Once such matters were uncovered, convents typically reacted with alarm and deliberate forgetting. The pregnant nun might be sent away on retreat or appear to suffer a sudden illness, necessitating complete isolation. If she gave birth, the infant was often discreetly taken away at night, possibly to an orphanage or another secret refuge. a sympathetic family member, or, in the darker instances, no support at all. Some newborns were quietly laid to rest on convent lands, their gravestones bearing inscriptions resembling vague apologies to God. The question of the father always followed, with answers that differed widely. They might be priests, traveling nobles, or gardeners. In one unforgettable case, the accused was a roaming musician carrying a harp and wearing an inappropriate grin. No more explanation was offered or required. Punishments were similarly unpredictable. Nuns born into humble origins could be excommunicated and dismissed in disgrace, while those from noble lineage often faced only severe warnings and a temporary leave. One particularly bold abbess was discovered with a lover and a child, yet somehow retained her position. Clearly, rules were applied unevenly at that time. Naturally, the Church maintained these were rare, unfortunate, and profoundly regrettable exceptions. Yet historical documents indicate otherwise. Parchment does not deceive, especially when steeped in scandal. If medieval convents misjudged anything, it was the influence of written records. Romance within the cloister was a subtle endeavor, concealed, coded, and penned in elaborate Latin that could be either a love declaration or a fervent prayer. Nuns might have pledged silence, but their pens were far less restrained. Letters meant everything. When direct encounters were too dangerous and significant glances across the chapel insufficient, affection discovered its loophole. Messages were sent through ink and wax. Some slipped through gaps in the cloister walls. Others were hidden inside loaves of bread or entrusted to novice members who excelled at maintaining poker faces despite their suspicious helpfulness. The letter's contents varied from tender to scandalous. One nun confessed in a letter to her priest lover that she yearned to drink from his chalice of devotion. The bishop overseeing the investigation was so disturbed he commanded the letter to be burned twice to ensure its destruction. These clandestine entanglements were not always brief affairs. Some endured for many years. A nun in France corresponded with a young nobleman for more than 10 years, outlasting 2 abbesses and surviving at least 3 unsuccessful attempts to apprehend her. Her capture came only after she referenced Ovid too precisely in the convent's choir book. Unsurprisingly, the Church viewed such literary passion harshly. When these love letters were discovered, severe consequences ensued. Excommunication, acts of penance, confinement to solitary prayer, or worse, a forced public reading of the letters before the entire convent, which was likely more humiliating than any divine judgment. As for the lovers, if they were members of the clergy, they were typically reassigned to colder, less romantic locations. If they were lay people, one man was once whipped, fined, and strictly ordered never to speak to women of the cloth again, to which he cheekily replied, "Can I still write?" Even more mortifying were occasions when these love letters were intercepted and circulated like medieval gossip. Imagine dedicating countless hours to crafting your most profound and sacred emotions, only to have them recited aloud by a chuckling beginner over meals of meat and cheese. Nevertheless, the ink kept flowing, since when barriers were high and eyes observant, love found ways to flourish through metaphor, suggestion, and unmistakably determined penmanship. In principle, a convent was meant to be a sanctuary of chastity. Yet, in truth, it resembled a boarding school surrounded by walls and occasionally equipped with an unexpected number of escape options. Medieval nuns were not only spiritually restless, many were also quite resourceful in physical terms. If you picture delicate women quietly tiptoeing across a garden gate, that image would be mistaken. Some escape efforts involved climbing walls using bed linens, bribing guards, squeezing through concealed tunnels, and in one instance, even dressing up as a monk and simply strolling out the main entrance as if it were an ordinary day of the week. The reasons for fleeing varied widely. Some sought reunion with secret lovers, others detested the rigidity of monastic existence, while a few wished to return home upon realizing that lifelong silence truly meant no speaking, not even during mealtime. Arguably the most famous fugitive was Sister Benedita from Verona. Sent to the convent when she was only 14 years old, she made 3 separate escape attempts. On her third try, she disguised herself as a novice from a nearby abbey, forged travel documents, and slipped away hidden among a cart full of vegetables. She reportedly managed to reach halfway to Venice before being captured, not because her disguise was uncovered, but due to unforeseen circumstances. She kept attempting to flirt with the guard. Some escapes were far more sensational. In Saxony, a group of nuns orchestrated a joint escape following their abbess's musical event. They subdued the gatekeeper using a loaf of old bread and disappeared into the forest. Church officials later described them as confused and unapologetic, which honestly sounds like the perfect tagline for a gripping medieval drama. When captured, runaway nuns were generally dragged back and endured a harsh mix of public humiliation, fasting, and confinement in a cold stone chamber furnished only with a crucifix and a heavy sense of disappointment. Those who fled repeatedly, and there were quite a few, might be sent to stricter convents where the meals were even worse and the walls significantly taller. Yet, for some, that strictness alone could not quell their rebellious spirit. A handful of nuns managed to escape, wed their beloveds, and live the rest of their lives pretending they had never set foot in a cloister, let alone resided in one. Sometimes the habit simply did not suit them, and the opportunity to flee was there. Every scandal requires a symbol, and within the records of convent misconduct, Sister Agnes of Würzburg certainly earns her own stained-glass window, preferably one that could blush. Agnes was reportedly an intelligent and captivating nun, gifted in music, prayer, and famously hosting a knight in her cell for over 1 year. Yes, a real knight, complete with armor, sword, and probably a tragic backstory. His name has unfortunately been lost to time, which the situation is suspicious on its own. However, what we do know is that Tom was reportedly healing from injuries received in combat. The exact location of this battle remains uncertain. It might have happened in a field, a tavern, or even in the convent courtyard after he stumbled while trying to sneak inside. According to the bishop's records, the knight was found when a novice alert about unusual clanking sounds coming from Agnes's cell. Upon checking, church authorities discovered the man concealed behind a tapestry, eating preserved figs and quietly humming hymns to pass the time. That was his only defense. Sister Agnes serves as a healer of both body and spirit. Agnes, to her credit, did not deny the relationship. In fact, she appeared genuinely irritated by the interruption. She insisted she was tending to the injured, and that compassion is a sacred virtue, which is true, although seldom used as an excuse for living with a boyfriend clad in chain mail. The scandal shook the convent not only due to the affair itself, but also because of its length. A few weeks or even a secret meeting would be forgivable, but an entire year during which the knight was spotted at least twice wearing a borrowed monk's robe and assisting with garden work took dedication and effort. The consequences were immediate and dramatic. Agnes was removed from her role, publicly humiliated, and sent to a stricter religious order. The knight was penalized and exiled, although one document notes dryly that he showed no sign of remorse, which might be the most remarkable part of the story. A medieval way to describe his expression would be that Tom smirked throughout the entire time. As for Agnes, she later composed letters denouncing the hypocrisy of the church, citing scripture and medical knowledge as her defense. One phrase stood out clearly. She wrote, "If I had allowed him to die, I would still be a sinner." Not every scandal in medieval convents involved hidden knights or secret correspondence. Some were much more audible, filled with moans, cries, and trembling in full public sight, all while claiming direct contact with the divine. This is where the mystic nun comes into the story. During the Middle Ages, certain nuns became known for experiencing ecstatic religious visions. These were not ordinary quiet moments of prayer or meditation. Instead, these experiences involved the entire body with eyes turning upward and shaking on the floor in spiritual rapture. While some church authorities considered these visions sacred, others grew suspicious. The main question was why these visions seemed so passionately expressive. Consider Sister Beatrix from the Low Countries, who insisted that Christ visited her every night, not just symbolically, but in physical form. Her writings spoke of embraces filled with divine warmth and spiritual connection beyond the limits of the flesh. At one point, she declared herself married to the Lamb, a term that may sound benign, until reading how she likened his presence to a fire spreading both inside and outside her being. Subtle, it was not. Then there is Hadavich of Antwerp, a 13th-century mystic whose poems read like a medieval version of a passionate romance novel if that novel were set entirely within a chapel. She wrote of consuming love and being pierced by the divine. Some of her words shone with such brilliance that later church scholars attempted to rework them into more fitting metaphors. Yet the original texts remain intact and quite surprising. To be honest, not every nun pretended to experience spiritual ecstasy. Many truly felt it. Medieval religious teachings encouraged deep emotional bonds with Christ, often expressed in terms that modern readers might consider suitable only for mature audiences. Nevertheless, genuine devotion does not negate the fact that these visions sparked significant excitement, both spiritually and in other ways. Not all observers were convinced. Certain bishops claimed these women were seeking attention. Others expressed concern about the effect these experiences might have on younger, more vulnerable nuns. One notably doubtful archbishop described them as hysteria cloaked in sanctity. He was later moved to a different position, possibly for voicing what others silently thought. Meanwhile, some mystic nuns rose to fame. Their visions were documented, copied, and highly revered, which in medieval context meant they successfully passed off imaginative writings as divine revelations. If medieval monasteries had one well-known trait, it was the strict control of the body, speech, and especially food. Fasting was considered sacred. Enduring hunger was a moral strength. Desire was a temptation best left outside, like the serpent in the garden. Yet inside certain convents, fasting often functioned more as a gentle daytime guideline, because after the bell ceased ringing and the abbess withdrew inside her chamber, a unique kind of ceremony began, the forbidden feast. Convents were expected to maintain a strict diet consisting mostly of porridge, bread, occasional fish, and an existential crisis for dessert. Meat, rich cheeses, sweets, and wine were generally prohibited, especially during Lent, or any of the numerous fasting days that made up nearly half the year. But let's face it, nobody can survive on boiled cabbage forever without secretly planning something different. And so they did. Some nuns created hidden culinary networks. Trusted merchants delivered salted meats under the pretense of medicinal use. Wine was disguised as consecrated vinegar. Honey cakes were supposedly reserved for visitors who never appeared. One surviving inventory from a convent listed 2 ducks, a whole ham, a jug of cherry wine, and 3 wheels of cheese. These were recorded as liturgical supplies. You can imagine what that implies. Late-night feasts became a secret tradition. Imagine a candlelit room deep within the convent where giggling nuns whispered psalms between bites of roasted goose. One novice even burned her hand while sneaking hot pastries from the oven, insisting it was a punishment from the Holy Spirit. No one believed her, yet the pastries were said to be delicious. Occasionally, these gatherings turned into social events with visiting men, merchants, priests, or even men who had no official reason to be inside a convent after dark. In fact, one abbey in Burgundy was discovered unauthorized gatherings were being held, which ended up being regular Saturday night feasts, complete with dancing, gambling, and what the bishop tactfully called inappropriate behavior. Naturally, not every nun participated. Many were sincerely devoted and appalled by such excess, but some, let us just say, their version of fasting involved eating quickly before anyone noticed. Few things unsettled medieval church officials more than a nun showing signs of pregnancy, unless, of course, that sign turned into a baby and then into a shallow grave beneath the convent pantry. One of the most disturbing scandals came from a 14th-century French convent where whispers spread about strange sounds coming from the basement. It was neither rodents nor faulty pipes. According to a horrified novice, something was crying that had no business being there. When church investigators arrived, they anticipated finding the usual items, a hidden wine stash, some forbidden cheese, or perhaps a secret love letter. Instead, they uncovered a roughly dug patch of earth beneath a barrel of pickled cabbage. Beneath it lay the body of a newborn, wrapped in what was obviously a torn wimple, the head covering worn by the sisters. The implication was clear. The subsequent inquiry was as fragile as a plague wagon. The mother was never publicly identified, though several nuns were quietly transferred soon after, a polite way of saying, "Please vanish silently before this escalates." The situation turned into a formal inquiry. When questioned, the abbess pretended to be unaware. She claimed, "I was not told about any childbirth," while standing near a questionably well-used wash basin. She insisted that any woman who gave birth within the convent must have already been pregnant upon entry, a worn-out excuse that is among the oldest and most ineffective in scandal history. This event was not unusual. Across Europe, secret pregnancies occasionally ended tragically. Newborns were abandoned at monastery doors. Some infants were quietly passed on to caring families. Sadly, some did not live long enough to be cared for at all. The Church's reaction mixed anger with selective forgetfulness. Punishments ranged from public apologies to silent relocations. Yet, as long as the convent's walls stayed intact and documents remained hidden, many of these cases were buried forever, both physically and metaphorically. Nevertheless, whenever a cellar was renovated or a storeroom cleaned, there lurked the slight chance of uncovering another hidden secret, a small scandal wrapped in cloth and silence. When judging what nuns were forbidden to do, running a brothel ranked somewhere between heresy and throwing a bishop out of a window. However, in 15th century Bologna, a former nun named Sister Claria decided she had grown tired of vows, veils, and virtue. She left the convent and opened a thriving brothel in her former convent building, continuing to use the habits. Because discretion was, apparently she was never truly meant to be part of the business plan. Tom had never exactly fit the mold for convent life. Church documents describe her as headstrong and often missing from evening prayers. In other words, she skipped Vespers and likely had other plans involving wine and a man named Marco. Her exit from the convent was not filled with drama. She simply walked away and never came back. The real excitement began when people passing by noticed the convent had suddenly become very popular among men with no interest in religion. According to a local official, Tom hired women, some former nuns, and others just creatively unemployed, and managed the place with military precision. Customers reportedly paid more for costumes. Some even asked for a full confession experience, which raised theological dilemmas no one wanted to face. When the church learned about this, panic spread, not because prostitution was uncommon, but because this brothel dared to look like a convent and operate more efficiently than many monasteries. The image was terrible. When Tom was called to explain, she just shrugged and said, "At least no one here pretends to be chaste." She was excommunicated and then excommunicated again, to be certain. The building was confiscated, the business shut down, and Tom was supposedly sent to a convent far from Bologna, which seems strange but could be seen as a fitting twist of fate. Her influence endured for many years thereafter. The place was informally called the Sanctuary of Pleasure. It even featured in various plays and songs on stage. Although the church attempted to erase her from history, Clara Ara evolved into a sort of folk hero. The nun who abandoned salvation and embraced service instead. Confession was considered the spiritual reboot of medieval Catholicism. For a nun, it was meant to be a solemn act of introspection, humility, and repentance. You knelt silently and whispered your wrongdoings. The priest granted forgiveness. In theory, you left feeling relieved, but in reality, confession sometimes resulted in more faults than absolution provided. Here comes the scandal of the confessor, a type of misconduct so widespread it nearly became a stereotype. The scenario was straightforward. One priest, numerous nuns, and an enclosed area intended specifically for confidential discussions about temptation. What could possibly go awry? Quite a lot, as it happened. Some confessors fulfilled their duties earnestly. Others regarded their spiritual role as an open license to explore the nun's emotional world, particularly if she was young, fearful, or from a privileged family whose power might shield them both. Boundaries were fragile. curtains thick, and church oversight was mostly theoretical. In one notorious example, Father Anselm of Tours heard the confessions of 30 nuns and somehow developed a particular emotional closeness with 10 of them. The abbess started to grow suspicious when Sister Magdalene came out of confession, laughing and carrying a faint scent of clove wine. Stories of inappropriate behavior spread quietly throughout Europe. Some confessors were found meeting nuns at strange hours. Others received love letters cleverly disguised as religious inquiries. One confessor was caught with his hand resting on a novice's knee, claiming he was examining her for signs of demonic possession. At least that showed some imagination. The church's reaction was a quiet hush, followed by relocation. A confessor accused of wrongdoing was often reassigned to a different diocese, which in medieval terms meant, go do it somewhere else, and try not to be caught this time. Meanwhile, the nuns found themselves in uncomfortable situations. Some were shamed, others were fully blamed, accused of tempting the priest with their feminine allure, which often simply meant being under 30 years old. A few chose to never confess again, preferring silence over holiness. Certainly, not every confession turned into a scandal. However, the arrangement of male authority, female obedience, and secretive talks was almost an open door to abuse, especially when cloaked in incense and Latin prayers. Not all convent mischief revolved around desire or the body. Some came from nuns who seemed unusually helpful and had access to plants that could either alleviate headaches or end pregnancies. Almost every convent had an herb garden. It was an essential part of their daily monastic routine. Nuns prepared salves, teas, and other remedies from these plants, blending healing with discretion. These gardens were both a source of comfort and power within the cloistered walls. Tinctures and herbal remedies were used to treat ailments ranging from stomach discomfort to alleged demonic possession, although the success with the latter was uncertain. In some communities, these modest healers evolved into what could be called convent chemists. The boundary between medicine and mischief began to fade. They were recognized as the apothecary sisters and possessed an intimate knowledge of their plants, sometimes too intimate. Many had training in the use of abortive herbs such as pennyroyal, tansy, and rue, which were subtly employed to regulate irregular menstrual cycles. Naturally, the official reasoning remained deliberately vague. The potion might be described as a cure for nervous conditions or persistent humoral imbalances. Yet everyone understood the true meaning when a nun visited the herbarium, whispering with flushed cheeks and a trembling voice. Certain convents quietly gained a reputation as sanctuaries for women facing delicate issues. A noblewoman dealing with an inconvenient pregnancy might suddenly choose a spiritual retreat and reappear after 2 months looking noticeably slimmer and far more pious. Sister Hildegard of Trier became especially renowned, recorded as an herbalist of great discretion. According to a very anxious male observer, her brews could soothe a restless body, hush an inconvenient cough, or reverse what the flesh had done. The poetic language was hard not to admire. Naturally, the Church never gave official approval. Yet, as long as secrecy was maintained and the patients departed feeling thankful rather than troubled, things were tolerated. In cases of pregnancy, only a handful of bishops dared to ask questions. It was often simpler to believe that the sisters possessed a remarkable talent for teasing. Nevertheless, darker rumors persisted. Tales circulated about potions secretly added to wine or spells of love crafted using hair and bone. Most of these stories were probably blown out of proportion. However, certain convents did face official investigations for supposedly harboring witch-like behaviors, and in 15th century Europe, such scrutiny from local inquisitors was far from welcome. For the majority of medieval nuns, public exposure posed a serious spiritual risk. Yet for some it became a legal obligation, especially when personal misdeeds escalated into public court cases. Throughout Europe, convents were sometimes forced into secular legal battles. The reasons varied widely, from inheritance conflicts and claims on dowries to disputes over land. More embarrassingly, some cases involved illicit relationships, hidden pregnancies, and conduct deemed unworthy of a bride of Christ. This last phrase was frequently used as medieval legal jargon to indicate that someone had been involved in questionable activities. One of the most remarkable cases happened in Florence, where a nun named Sister Constanza took a priest to court over a breach of promise. She claimed he seduced her during confession, pledged to abandon the priesthood, but ultimately failed to do so. To support her claims, she presented letters, witnesses, and even a sharply written poem. The court became so overwhelmed that it postponed the verdict for 3 years, hoping those involved would either pass away or vow eternal silence. Another notable case in Cologne involved an abbess accused of embezzling convent funds to purchase luxurious linens, spiced wine, and presents for guests. It turned out that the visitors were men under 30, unusually well-groomed for pilgrims. The trial documents resembled an expense report for an upscale hotel. The abbess insisted these items were intended for spiritual hospitality. The court disagreed. Occasionally, the church preferred to manage matters internally. Canon law was meant to deal with misbehaving nuns. However, when offenses crossed into civil law territory such as theft, child abandonment, or contract fraud, secular judges had to intervene, often finding themselves ill-prepared for veiled women reciting scripture while denying everything with holy indignation. One nun in Burgundy faced accusations of assaulting another nun over a man. During her interrogation, she claimed she had been possessed by jealousy and perhaps even by the devil. This double defense earned her a lighter sentence and a transfer. These courtroom scenes were generally suppressed as soon as possible. The church did not like airing its internal dramas, yet rumors inevitably spread. Local taverns buzzed with comments like, "Did you hear about the nun with the wine tab?" or "She brought her dowry and boyfriend to court." In a society where few could read and even fewer verify facts, relics were the medieval equivalent of verified status symbols, and some convents amassed them with the enthusiasm of a teenager at a clearance sale. Holy bones, scraps of fabric, droplets of saintly blood. These artifacts attracted pilgrims, donations, and status. For many nuns, relics represented holy links to the divine. For others, they served more as sources of income. Consider Abbess Euphemia of Thuringia, who asserted that her convent possessed a strand from Mary Magdalene's hairbrush. It was not a fragment of the true cross or a piece of the veil, but rather a grooming tool belonging to one of Scripture's most misunderstood figures. Euphemia described it as scented by heaven and encouraged travelers to kneel before it and leave coins. However, when examined by the bishop, it appeared to be nothing more than a comb from a local trader, faintly carrying the scent of rosemary and goat. There was also the convent in Bruges that proudly exhibited what was claimed to be the fingernail of Saint Apollonia, the patron saint of toothaches. Yet, when experts investigated, they discovered it was actually a sliver of cow horn. The abbess maintained that the power did not come from the relic itself, but from the belief in its significance. This was certainly a daring theological shift. Some nuns grew especially inventive. One claimed to have a handkerchief used by the Virgin Mary that was still wet with tears centuries later. Another insisted she had a thorn from the crown of thorns, despite living in a convent located hundreds of miles away from any known trading routes. When questioned about how she obtained it, she only smiled and said, "The Lord provides." To be fair, not all relics were forgeries. Some were genuinely old, mysterious, and possibly sacred, yet the overwhelming number of claimed relics raised questions about their authenticity and purpose. Within convents, including 6 distinct ones, relics such as skulls believed to belong to John the Baptist and 3 navels attributed to Christ indicate that enthusiasm could sometimes override precision. Nevertheless, these relics served their purpose. Pilgrims arrived, coins jingled, and convents, unable to draw crowds with sermons, found that possessing bones, whether authentic or not, made for terrific promotion. Behind the cloistered walls, life was not just about prayer and penance. Certain nuns managed subtle power networks, handling correspondence, overseeing landholdings, and outsmarting bishops, all while appearing deeply invested in embroidery. These women were abbesses from noble backgrounds who grasped a key truth about medieval society. Power was not sinful if it was called stewardship. Consider Abbess Matilda of Essen, who governed her abbey much like a duchy. She arranged land transactions, welcomed royal visitors, and even once corrected a count's Latin in public. She was both feared and respected for her piety, a blend that enabled her to accomplish much without ever stepping outside the convent walls. Many convents controlled expansive estates. Although the church disapproved of women exercising authority, it had no objection to collecting taxes from them. This entrusted abbesses and senior nuns with responsibilities over finances, farming operations, and settling disputes with tenant farmers. Like any savvy landowners, they occasionally resorted to bribery, altered deeds, and influenced tithes through blessings to ensure favorable outcomes. A convent in Normandy once successfully settled a dispute with a rival monastery by negotiating its own agreement after a conflict over fishing rights escalated into a serious territorial clash. At that time, the abbess called Sister Julianne composed a peace letter, which scholars find remarkably sharp for someone committed to humility. In essence, she delivered a scathing rebuke to the abbot in perfect Latin. Meanwhile, noble families often placed their daughters in convents not solely out of religious devotion, but as a calculated move. A nun from an influential family could act as a family emissary, discreetly gathering intelligence, influencing decisions, or even obstructing papal orders by conveniently misplacing letters. Certain convents maintained spies or hired legal experts. Notably, one German abbey employed a scribe skilled in fencing, implying their document verification was particularly thorough. Naturally, the church took notice and occasionally attempted to intervene. However, as long as the nuns appeared pious, the higher authorities had limited options. It is impossible to excommunicate someone for being excessively capable, even if they unmistakably govern the place like a velvet-gloved crime syndicate. By the end of the Middle Ages, some convents had become akin to self-sufficient cities featuring their own economies, social rankings, rumors, secrets, and indeed the occasional covert baby exchange. Not all controversies came wrapped in charm or left behind affectionate notes. Some were marked by silence rather than sanctity. Consider a silence not born of ignorance, but of careful calculation. A silence that preserved good names, concealed tears, bloodshed, sudden ailments, and even the inexplicable disappearance of a nun who fell ill, whose chamber was reassigned to a newcomer through a discreet period of mourning. Occasionally, scandal did not erupt loudly. It followed established routines. For instance, there was Abbess Theodora, who led her convent with the authority of a medieval chief executive. She supervised extensive estates, entertained nobility, and organized prayer ceremonies so intricate that seating plans were mandatory. When 3 novices became expectant within a single year, she attributed this to spiritual trials and imposed harsher fasting on all but herself. When questioned by local church officials, she dismissed them as jealous and warned that she might deny prayers on their behalf, a formidable threat even by 14th century standards. Meanwhile, other religious houses embraced their notoriety. The Abbey of St. Lucilla near Milan quietly earned a reputation as a sanctuary for reformed women, a euphemism for former courtesans who dedicated 20% of their day to prayer and spent 80% adorned in lavish garments. They arranged musical performances, charged fees for festival processions, and maintained peacocks, genuine living peacocks, in their gardens. The regional bishop regarded them as a minor issue, yet the authorities in Rome saw a lucrative enterprise. Over in England, one nun became so adept at creating counterfeit indulgences that her forged documents traveled all the way to York Cathedral, where they received official blessings from a high-ranking clergyman. Before anyone even recognized them, the bishop was there. The printing was done with ink blended with berry wine. Even the most faithful were not untouched by unusual customs. One enigmatic nun declared she experienced spiritual visions exclusively while fasting and dancing simultaneously. Her superior finally forbade both actions, leading her to create a ritual called holy spinning. Visitors assumed she was possessed. She insisted she was merely showing divine happiness at 30 rotations per minute because beneath the layers of incense and sacred texts, something entirely different existed, raw, persistent life breaking through the cracks in the marble. Before becoming the world's most famous philosopher who lived in barrels, Diogenes was just a banker's son from the Greek city of Sinope. That is correct. The man who would later disdain gold and reject wealth was literally born into money. However, this status did not last long. Diogenes' life changed drastically when he and his father Hesius became involved in a clever crime related to the local currency. Not figuratively, they were accused of physically tampering with the coins, possibly by shaving them or forging them. It remains uncertain if Diogenes fully understood what he was doing or was simply assisting his father's enterprise. One thing is certain, the local officials did not find this amusing. Consequently, the future cynic was expelled. For most people, being banished from their birthplace would be devastating. For Diogenes, it turned out to be a turning point. He escaped to Athens, the city of philosophy. The center of the Greek world became the stage for a bold decision. Instead of retreating quietly into respectable society, Tom chose to dismantle it piece by piece, using biting sarcasm, a sharp wit, and a complete disregard for social norms. Athens at that time was crowded with esteemed thinkers and refined sophists. Plato, Aristotle, the whole elite circle. Tom, penniless and effectively homeless, paid no mind to their status. While others debated metaphysics wrapped in linen robes, he entered the city with a grin like a dog on a mission to reveal every hidden hypocrisy he could detect. And yes, dog-like is not just a figure of speech. He fully embraced the term. In fact, he proudly identified himself with the Greek word kynikos, meaning dog-like, from which we derive the word cynic, barking at corruption, challenging convention, and exposing truth in its raw, unfiltered form. His first priority was to abandon all social pretense. He rejected possessions, ridiculed manners, and chose to sleep in a giant ceramic jar, often wrongly called a barrel, much like a philosophical raccoon. This was his ultimate message. If society was just a facade, then he would live outside of it, literally. This stance was not mere rebellion for the sake of rebellion. Tom believed that true virtue arose from living in harmony with nature, and nature did not require wealth, reputation, or extravagant villas with 10 rooms. It only demanded honesty and perhaps a durable jar. If Athens was the heart of philosophical prestige, then Plato was its shining star, polished, revered, and far too serious for Tom's liking. Meanwhile, while Plato was busy classifying virtues and outlining abstract ideals, Diogenes was quite literally and metaphorically challenging them. One well-known story tells of Plato trying to define a human as a featherless biped, considering it a clever way to describe our species. Diogenes, always ready to use ridicule as a weapon, plucked a chicken and carried it into the academy, announcing loudly, "Behold, Plato's human!" The joke hit so hard that Plato had to change the definition by adding that humans have broad, flat nails. That was a win for the man in the jar. However, Diogenes was not merely seeking attention. He believed philosophers like Plato were too absorbed in meaningless abstractions, losing sight of living with genuine integrity. For Diogenes, virtue was not a topic for debate, but a way of life. If provoking the intellectual elite meant heckling them while eating onions and appearing homeless, he accepted that fate. He often disrupted Plato's lessons, wandering among the students with a lantern in broad daylight, muttering that he was searching for an honest man. The audience laughed nervously because deep down they recognized the truth in his words. Athens, despite its democratic principles and grand marble structures, had become a place of polite deception and theatrical philosophy. Diogenes cut through this with brutal honesty. Plato allegedly described Diogenes as Socrates gone mad, a comparison not entirely inaccurate. Like Socrates, Diogenes posed uncomfortable questions and refused to back down. Tom did not conform to societal expectations. Unlike Socrates, Tom did not seek a conversation. He desired a performance, and he gladly played the fool if it exposed hypocrisy. He made living simply seem outrageous. Tom shamelessly begged, consumed any leftover food he could find, and relieved himself wherever he wished, often shocking observers. Yet every act, no matter how uncouth, carried a philosophical message. Why should he feel embarrassment over natural acts when others showed no shame lying, cheating, or hoarding riches? While Plato imagined perfect worlds, Tom shattered the illusions of this one. If you asked him, that made him the true philosopher, even if he occasionally smelled like old olives and deep existential worry. At this point, Tom had become a full-time philosophical disruptor. He lacked a fixed home, except for a large ceramic jar where he slept, hidden in the marketplace like a living piece of urban art. His possessions were minimal, a cloak, a walking stick, and a cup, until he saw a boy drinking water with his hands and immediately discarded his own cup. "A child has beaten me in the art of plain living," he admitted. That was the essence of Tom. He did not merely talk about simplicity. He outdid everyone else in it. There was no pretense of rejecting wealth while secretly stashing silver beneath his mattress. No, he genuinely existed on leftovers, bathed in rainwater, and often shared the night with dogs. In fact, he described himself as a dog, not as an insult, but as a symbol of pride. Dogs exist naturally without shame, pretense, or concern for status. That was exactly the lifestyle Tom sought, barking included. Then there was the lamp or lantern, depending on how you interpret it, which he famously carried around during daylight hours. When asked, "What are you doing?" he would grumble, "Looking for an honest man." The underlying message was obvious. He was not expecting to find one. The humor was essential. It was a sharp rebuke to anyone who believed themselves virtuous, yet lived lives full of compromise. His everyday existence turned into a form of performance art, where each action served as a lesson. On one occasion, when caught masturbating in public, he reportedly said, "If only it were as simple to satisfy hunger by rubbing my stomach." Crude, unquestionably. But to Tom, natural acts held no shame. Hypocrisy did. To be clear, Tom was not poor out of necessity. He received offers of shelter, meals, and even support from affluent admirers. He rejected all of them much like someone avoiding a deceptive scheme. For him, accepting charity was equivalent to binding oneself with obligations, and Tom refused to be restrained. Neither money, nor social etiquette, nor society's uneasy reactions when he behaved uncivilized in public could hold him back. He did not merely exist on the margins of society. He deliberately positioned himself there like a thorn, sharp, irritating, and impossible to overlook. While others were diligently cleaning their masks, Tom proudly displayed his grime. In a world dominated by roles and customs, this was the most rebellious deed imaginable. One of the most memorable meetings in ancient philosophy, and possibly in all history, took place between the filthiest man in Athens and the strongest ruler on earth. Enter Alexander the Great, a young conqueror with the arrogance of a deity and a formidable army to support him. After hearing tales about Tom, Alexander became curious. Here was a man who possessed nothing, desired nothing, feared nothing, yet captivated the entire Greek world. Naturally, Alexander insisted on meeting him. He discovered Tom lounging in his jar, basking in the sun like a stray cat who just happened to be fluent in ethics and philosophy. The Macedonian king approached and asked the well-known question, "Is there anything I can do for you?" Without bothering to sit up, Tom answered, "Yes, move out of my sunlight, humble drop." Alexander's attendants were shocked. This man had just dismissed the ruler of most known lands as if he were a bothersome street vendor. Yet Alexander was deeply impressed. Legend has it, he turned to his companion saying, "If I were not Alexander, I would want to be Tom." This phrase is beloved by history teachers and often wrongly attributed in online discussions. But regardless of its truth, this moment perfectly captures the spirit of Tom. In a society obsessed with appearances and power, here was a man who embraced dirt and freedom like no other. With power, Tom was invincible because he desired absolutely nothing. He owned no grand estate, commanded no army, and had no reputation to defend. It is impossible to corrupt a man who rests in a jar. One cannot blackmail a man who begs for his meals. and certainly a man who mocks luxury cannot be impressed. What Diogenes demonstrated to Alexander and the world was that genuine power arises from wanting nothing and fearing nobody. That was Diogenes' ultimate form of rebellion, not by shouting in the streets or defying social customs in crude ways, but by reducing life to its simplest elements and daring anyone to label him poor. With just one sentence, he turned one of history's greatest conquerors into a mere shadow blocking the sunlight. Unlike most philosophers, Diogenes did not only speak about this freedom. He embodied it so intensely that even emperors felt diminished when near him. Imagine trying to impress your friends after meeting someone like that. Good luck with that. By that time, Diogenes was much more than a local oddball. He came to represent a revolutionary mindset known as cynicism, not the diluted form we use today to describe someone grumbling about politics. No, the original cynicism was wild, pure, and unkempt. Diogenes believed society had decayed because it was founded on falsehoods, lies about happiness, virtue, and success. People wasted their lives chasing riches, climbing social ranks, and filling their minds with empty ideals. Observing all this, Diogenes simply said, "No thanks. I would rather sleep in a pot and eat humble fare." Cynicism, at its heart, was about living in true harmony with nature. This meant letting go of all artificial desires, such as luxury, fame, and political ambitions, and returning to a lifestyle of simplicity and self-reliance. If nature did not provide you with a golden cup, then perhaps you did not truly need one. And since nature gave you a stomach, begging for bread or stealing a simple onion was more honest than flattering a politician. Tom's philosophy was also intensely provocative. He did not hide his beliefs in essays or temple scrolls. Instead, he lived them boldly. He mocked, barked, and even interrupted people physically to force them to confront their own contradictions. If a person preached virtue but lived extravagantly, Tom would follow them like a philosophical troublemaker, revealing the decay beneath their fine appearance. For Tom, deeds mattered far more than words or theories. In fact, he once said, "Other dogs bite their enemies. I bite my friends to save them." Because nothing expressed true friendship like a metaphorical nip on the ankle to wake someone from their illusions. He was particularly harsh when it came to hypocrisy, especially among philosophers. If a scholar claimed that poverty was noble while enjoying comfort, Tom would show them a mirror, both figuratively and literally. On one occasion, he witnessed a magnificent temple being constructed and declared, "The gods must be blind if they require such an elaborate home." In a society obsessed with appearances, Tom was the natural predator of image, hunting down those who disguised their true nature behind a polished facade. Tom had no grand ambitions in eloquence. He simplified everything completely, both literally and figuratively. He did not seek approval or popularity. His goal was to awaken people. If that required barking like a dog or even relieving himself on public monuments, then so be it. Truth, after all, was not always courteous. Dionysius was more than just a thinker. He was the living conscience of Athens, a crude, loud, and highly inconvenient one. Depending on who you asked, he was either a madman with digestive troubles or the only sane individual in a city full of deceivers. Perhaps both. He built a career on offending others. On one occasion during a banquet, he strolled barefoot over the expensive carpet, wiping mud from his feet while mumbling, "This is how I trample on Plato's pride." Not the usual behavior at formal events, yet for Dionysius it was more than mere rudeness. It was a stand against vanity, extravagance, and all the empty traditions people used to make themselves feel important. He confronted everyone. When he observed a wealthy man giving to the poor merely to gain admiration, Dionysius remarked, "That is not charity, it is investment." On another occasion, seeing a man angry after being slapped, he stated, "You should not be upset. It was only flesh meeting flesh." His approach was more than philosophy. It resembled psychological judo. However, the true brilliance of Dionysius was not limited to his words. It was reflected in how he lived his life. His everyday existence was a challenge to everything people accepted without question. He turned the world on its head. He held it in place, waiting to see what would happen as coins dropped out. Naturally, not everyone welcomed these free lessons. Tom faced mockery, hostility, and even arrest. Yet, attempting to detain a man without possessions or embarrassment was like trying to seize smoke. In one town, after being captured and sold as a slave, yes, truly, he calmly told the auctioneer, "Sell me to a man who requires a master." Let that sink in. Eventually, he was bought by a Corinthian named Xeniades, who did not merely purchase Tom. He brought him home, entrusted him with managing the household, educating the children, and, in effect, turning him into a sharply witty in-house life coach. Somehow, Tom transformed slavery into a public lecture series. Whether mocking rulers or guiding kids, Tom remained unwavering in his sharp sarcasm. He ridiculed all forms of authority, including those he inadvertently became part of. If anyone ever attempted to lavish him with praise, he would remind them he was merely a dog, chasing truth, and at times marking golden statues. He was society's ever-present irritant. The harder people tried to disregard him, the more deeply he embedded himself in their conscience. Saying Tom had strong views on social norms would be like claiming the sun is somewhat warm. His opposition went far beyond rejecting social niceties. He launched a one-man crusade against them with the intensity of a barefoot prophet and the cleanliness of a rebellious raccoon. Bathing was overrated, dining manners pointless, and shame nothing but a weapon used by cowards and hypocrites hiding behind marble facades. Tom believed that most social rules were not designed to help individuals. Instead, they served to control people, to shame them into fitting in, and to keep the wealthy above the poor. Consequently, he chose to live in a way that challenged every single one of these conventions. He frequently strolled barefoot through damaged streets, even during the cold winter months. When asked why he refused to wear shoes like an ordinary person, he answered, "If I needed shoes, I would be more worried about my life than my feet." Tom also had a talent for carrying out embarrassing bodily actions in public, and it was not due to ignorance. He was fully aware of his behavior. These actions were deliberate and carried meaning. He believed that anything natural and essential should never be a reason for embarrassment. To put it simply, if you are upset with me for burping but not for cheating your neighbor, your sense of right and wrong is flawed. Even the act of begging became a way to resist. While most beggars sought to evoke sympathy or social duty, Tom viewed it as a spiritual challenge both for himself and for those he asked. If they offered help, that was fine. If not, that was fine as well. In either case, he remained truthful and hungry. However, Tom's rebellion was not just for the sake of defiance. His entire life was one big experiment to discover how little a person truly needs to live well, not just to survive. He aimed to live with dignity, freedom, and a sharp sense of humor, powerful enough to cut through pretense and arrogance. Among politicians and the refined language of philosophers, Tom revealed the absurdity of social norms by completely disregarding them. The more society demanded he act according to accepted standards, the more he insisted on exposing how so-called cultured behavior was often just a series of rituals designed to boost our own egos. In a world obsessed with disguises, Tom was unmasked and probably barefoot, laughing in the sunlight, questioning why we never dared to be like him. Of course, Tom did not leave behind memoirs, marble sculptures, or shrines in his name. He would have despised such honors. Indeed, had someone attempted to erect a statue, he likely would have rejected it with scorn. His influence is found not in what he built, but in what he dismantled: delusions, pretenses, and pride. Regarding his passing, as with much of Tom's life, stories surrounding his death blend tragedy, absurdity, and a fitting sense of irony. Some suggest he died from holding his breath out of sheer boredom with existence. Others claim his end came from an infected dog bite, an ironic twist given his infamous nickname. Another tale says he simply lay down, said nothing, and never rose again. No grandiose final speech, no dramatic farewell, just the loudest skeptic disappearing quietly, as if even death failed to move him. When asked about his burial wishes, Tom allegedly answered, "Throw me beyond the city walls and let the wild creatures have me." Those who heard this were taken aback. When asked whether he feared animals tearing him apart, Dionysius responded, "Not if you hand me a stick to chase them off." The man then replied, "But you will not be able to use it." To that, Dionysius calmly said, "Then why should I worry about what happens to me after I die?" In this exchange, Dionysius scores 1, mortality scores 0. In the years following his passing, Dionysius's ideas did not vanish. Rather, they spread rapidly among those disillusioned by insincerity. His unique form of cynicism gave birth to an entire school of thought, shaping future philosophers such as Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius, who adopted his vision of self-reliance and virtue unsullied by wealth or social standing. Even now, in a world obsessed with filters, followers, and fortune, Dionysius's message remains strikingly relevant. He reminds us that real freedom emerges not from possession, but from desiring less. That true honor springs not from titles, but from living according to one's principles, even if those principles involve yelling at statues or residing in a barrel. Although he died without money, shelter, or shoes, Dionysius left behind something far more lasting than material wealth: a challenging truth. This truth sticks in your mind like a splinter, forcing you to either laugh at yourself or, at the very least, question why you are not carrying a lantern. You might assume a man who barked at citizens, slept in a jar, and openly criticized Plato would become a forgotten name in the history of philosophy. Yet Dionysius has become a symbol not of insanity, but of radical integrity and unwavering honesty. Honesty in a world built on illusions is rare. The fact that we still discuss Tom after more than 2,000 years reveals something important. It suggests that deep inside, people remain eager for truth, even if it is unpleasant, or lives a humble existence. Tom matters today because his existence was a challenge to society. He dared to question what happens when you stop pretending, when you no longer pursue wealth, status, or comfort, and live simply with only what you need. If you remove all the facades, the polite untruths, and carefully constructed personas, what remains? According to Tom, the answer is genuine freedom. In a culture obsessed with appearances, whether it was ancient Athens or modern platforms like Instagram, his refusal to conform to surface-level values resonates more strongly than ever. He did not just challenge authority or wealth, he challenged the very necessity of them. This is why thinkers ranging from Stoics to anarchists to comedians have found inspiration in his story. He is the original minimalist, the spiritual predecessor to every tale of someone leaving a high-paying career to live simply and freely. Even Tom's unfiltered behavior served a purpose. His use of shock was not meant to offend, but to reveal uncomfortable truths. He aimed to make people feel uneasy, as discomfort is the starting point for reflection. If you feel more disturbed by a person acting naturally in public than by corruption in government or greed in religion, Tom would argue that your values are misplaced. Although his approach was unconventional, the core lesson remains eternal. True virtue is not found in appearances or possessions, but in living authentically without pretense. Something you purchase, a label or a broadcast, is not just a product. It represents how you exist when nobody watches, or in Diogenes' situation, when literally everyone is observing and you remain indifferent. He teaches us that wisdom does not always come draped in robes. At times it screams from a container, mocks you openly, and stubbornly stays basked in sunlight. In a world saturated with noise, marketing, and absurdities, Diogenes encourages us to be unique, genuine, unrefined, and a bit like a dog. Perhaps that is precisely why he stands as the wisest madman to have ever lived. By the early 1870s, the northern plains simmered with tension, a slow and relentless buildup of shattered promises, land seizures, and cultural clashes. Central to this turmoil were the Black Hills, a land sacred to the Lakota Sioux, who called it Baja Sapa. The United States government had officially recognized this area as Lakota territory in the 1868 Fort Laramie Treaty. Officially, the land was theirs eternally. Yet in this context, forever lasted only about 6 years. Everything shifted in 1874 when gold was found in the Black Hills during an expedition led by none other than George Armstrong Custer. News spread quickly, and like bees to honey, Thousands of miners flooded the area, breaking the treaty and desecrating holy ground. Instead of upholding its own pact, the government attempted to purchase the land from the Lakota, who declined. This conflict was never just about gold. It was a matter of survival, sovereignty, and the gradual loss of their heritage. The Lakota and their allies had become enemies in the eyes of Washington. They were no longer seen as negotiators, but as opponents. The U.S. Army received orders to relocate all Native groups to reservations by the end of January in the year 1876. Any groups that did not follow this directive were to be considered hostile. Many tribes never even got the message due to being spread out over huge winter hunting territories. Others simply rejected the demand. They were unwilling to surrender their independence in exchange for a life constrained by reliance and imprisonment. What was developing on the plains was more than just a disagreement. It was a confrontation destined to explode. A loose federation of Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho fighters, led by iconic leaders such as Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, started to assemble. They were not an official army, yet united by a fierce determination to defend their lands, their people, and their traditions. They understood that conflict was inevitable. Meanwhile, U.S. military commanders, confident in their superior numbers and advanced weaponry, underestimated the tribes as fractured and disorganized. They could not have been more mistaken. The Plains warriors moved swiftly, knew the landscape intimately, and were driven by the strongest convictions. The tension was electric. The ignition had begun. Soon, the confrontation destined to be called the Battle of Little Big Horn was rapidly approaching its place in history. Tom was no ordinary military leader. By 1876, he had become a famous name, known as a bold and controversial hero from the Civil War, with a reputation for daring actions and risky decisions. Tom Custer was driven by a perilous craving for fame. With his long blonde hair, ostentatious uniforms, and hunger for headlines, he appeared more at home on a stage than on a battlefield. Yet his boldness earned him a mixture of admiration and envy. Following the Civil War, Custer was assigned to the western frontier as a lieutenant colonel in the 7th United States Cavalry. His mission was to enforce federal Indian policies which increasingly involved relocating native tribes onto reservations, peacefully whenever possible, or by force if needed. By the year 1876, Custer was eager for combat. His political aspirations were growing, and a clear military success could repair his reputation after a public dispute with President Ulysses Grant's administration. He was not simply pursuing Native Americans, he was seeking significance. As tensions heightened with the Lakota and their allies, Custer was instructed to take part in a three-pronged operation to find and defeat the so-called hostiles. The strategy was to surround the native camps and compel their surrender. Custer's troops would advance from the east while General John Gibbon's forces came from the west, and General George Crook's men moved in from the south. From the outset, the plan suffered due to excessive confidence and lack of coordination. The land was rough, the distances vast, and the intelligence uncertain at best. Most U.S. officers, including Custer, believed they were confronting a small, scattered band of warriors. They had no idea that the reality was far more complex. Thousands of Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho had assembled for a summer gathering near the Little Bighorn River, creating the largest native force ever gathered on the plains. Tom, as always, wished to act quickly and seize glory for himself. He refused reinforcements, chose not to bring Gatling guns that would slow his movement, and ignored orders to wait. Instead, he advanced with 600 men, dividing his troops into three groups for a surprise assault. This move was daring, confident, and tragically mistaken. What awaited was not a scattered village of weakened fighters, but a united, well-prepared force determined to protect its way of life. Tom, with his usual bravado, was about to enter a story of both legend and disaster. While the U.S. Army relied on inaccurate maps and flawed assumptions, something remarkable was unfolding along the Little Bighorn River. Thousands of Lakota Sioux, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho had come together not initially to fight, but to hold their traditional summer camp. This was a moment to rest, hunt, perform ceremonies, and bond as families and allies. Yet the political realities of the year 1876 cast a serious shadow over the gathering. Native leaders understood what was approaching. They had witnessed broken treaties, disappearing buffalo herds, and the invasion of railroads and settlers. They knew that this peaceful assembly could soon turn into a battlefield, and they prepared accordingly. The center of this growing alliance was Tom, a strong Lakota holy man and a visionary leader. In the weeks before the battle, he carried out an intense Sundance ceremony filled with sacrifice and prayer. Witnesses said Tom experienced a vision during this ritual. He foresaw soldiers falling into the camp like swarms of grasshoppers, broken and defeated. For his followers, this was not just a symbol, but a true prophecy. Alongside him was Crazy Horse, a warrior known for almost legendary skill and courage. Reserved and dedicated entirely to protecting his people, Crazy Horse had already made a name for himself as a brave leader in previous fights. He was about to prove his valor once again by fearlessly charging enemy lines with a mix of boldness and smart tactics. Other leaders, such as Gall and Two Moons, rose as important voices. Even though the tribes lacked a single unified leadership, their solidarity at this moment was extraordinary. They were fighting for more than territory. They were defending freedom itself. The numbers vary, but estimates suggest that between 8,000 and 10,000 native people were gathered in Little Bighorn Valley, including roughly 1,500 to 2,000 warriors. They were well armed, many possessing repeating rifles and a deep understanding of the landscape. Most importantly, they were fighting for their homes, loved ones, and a way of life at risk of disappearing. Custer had anticipated facing only a few hundred desperate fighters. Instead, he encountered far more than he expected. Tom was about to confront a powerful alliance, one forged not only through resistance but through deep spiritual commitment, ancestral responsibility, and an unyielding determination to survive. The tension was mounting. On the 22nd of June, 1876, Tom and his 7th Cavalry departed from the mouth of the Rosebud River, following trails thought to lead to a nearby indigenous settlement. They traveled swiftly for 3 days, pushing both men and horses to the brink of exhaustion. Tom believed the native village would scatter if they detected the soldiers approaching. His plan was to attack first, strike with force, and seize honor before General Terry or Gibbon had a chance to arrive and claim the credit. However, this rush caused him to overlook the need for caution. Scouts, including renowned Crow and Arikara warriors, warned Tom that the settlement ahead was enormous, unlike anything they had witnessed before. Some scouts ascended tall ridges and returned with wide eyes, reporting too many to count. They advised Tom to pause and reconsider his plan, but he refused. On the morning of June 25th, Tom reached a ridge overlooking the Little Bighorn Valley. From that vantage point, he spotted parts of the vast encampment. Tepes stretched along the river like a small city. Smoke rose from cooking fires, children played nearby, and horses grazed peacefully. What Tom saw as a vulnerable village was actually a slumbering giant. Still confident he could catch them off guard, he made the critical choice to split his 600-strong regiment. He ordered Captain Frederick Benteen to scout southward with 125 men. Major Marcus Reno received orders to assault the southern part of the village with 140 soldiers. Meanwhile, Custer himself led approximately 210 men northward, aiming to encircle the village and trap the warriors in a pincer movement. This plan was daring and dangerous, but tragically built on incorrect assumptions. Custer was unaware that the warriors had already detected the soldiers' approach. Lakota scouts had noticed dust clouds and advancing troops. Therefore, the surprise element vanished before it could even start. As Reno's troops moved down into the valley, they did not encounter terrified families fleeing. Instead, they found warriors gathering, far more than they had ever expected. Rather than retreating, the camp transformed into a coordinated defense, commanded by the very people Custer had underestimated. At that moment, the belief in the U.S. Army's invincibility began to fade. The 7th Cavalry was marching directly into a deadly situation, and Custer was leading them right into its center. At about 3 o'clock in the afternoon on June 25, 1876, Major Marcus Reno and his forces charged the southern edge of the native settlement. They anticipated chaos, women and children running away, warriors disorganized and retreating. What they faced was precisely the opposite, a disciplined, intense resistance. Within moments, the assault started to fall apart. Reno's men dismounted among the trees by the riverbank and began shooting. However, the sheer amount of enemy fire stunned them. The warriors were not only numerous, but also quick and fiercely determined. The Lakota and Cheyenne warriors moved rapidly across the open terrain with incredible speed, many riding horses and shooting with lethal precision. Several of them carried Winchester and Spencer repeating rifles, which were far more advanced compared to the single-shot carbines used by the cavalry. Tom Reno became frantic. Instead of maintaining his ground, he gave a disorderly command to mount up and withdraw across the river. In the confusion, numerous soldiers were shot, and some even drowned. What should have been an organized retreat soon turned into a chaotic rout. Bloodied and disoriented, Reno's troops climbed a bluff on the eastern riverbank, struggling to set up a defensive line. At that moment, Captain Frederick Bentyne arrived from the south accompanied by reinforcements. Together, Reno and Bentyne managed to form a rough defensive perimeter at the site that would become known as Reno Hill. There, surrounded and under constant enemy fire, they dug in while running critically low on water. In the distance to the north, the sounds of gunfire could be heard, signaling the unfolding fate of Custer's own command, though they lacked precise information. They sent messengers out, but none came back. Meanwhile, below in the valley, native warriors flooded the battlefield, encouraged by Reno's retreat. Their spirits soared as the ancient prophecy seemed to come true. The invaders were far from invincible. They were in full flight, and more warriors were joining the fight. Until then, American military campaigns on the plains had been predictable. Native peoples had come to expect overwhelming force, swift attacks, and brutal reprisals, but now everything was changing. The fighters operated on their own terms, agile and resolute, driven by both vision and fury. While Tom struggled to survive atop the hill, confused about what had gone wrong, Custer advanced toward the north, unaware that the entire tactical system he depended upon had already fallen apart. This encounter was no longer about tactics, but had shifted into a fight for survival, with Custer running out of time. As Tom's troops withdrew in disarray and Bentyne worked to strengthen defenses on Tom Hill, Custer and his 210 men pushed forward, completely oblivious to the fierce conflict raging behind them. Still believing that the village could be approached from different directions, Custer's unit moved along elevated ground, aiming to attack the village's backside. However, the warriors were anticipating their move. By then, the alarm had spread throughout the large encampment. Hundreds of Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho fighters surged toward Custer's column. Instead of encountering vulnerable women and children, Custer was met with an overwhelming force of mounted warriors. His soldiers were thinly spread across ridges and hills, trying to maintain defensive posts, but they were rapidly encircled. The exact details of the battle remain uncertain since no one from Custer's immediate command survived. What is evident is that the 7th Cavalry was overrun within a few hours by native forces led by warriors such as Crazy Horse and Gall. Outnumbered and outsmarted, Jack's men fell victim to a superior knowledge of the land and fierce tactics that tore apart the cavalry's formation. The soldiers attempted to hold their ground on what later became known as Last Stand Hill. Surrounded with no ammunition and no chance to escape, they perished. Some fell in small groups, others alone, and a few reportedly chose to end their own lives rather than be captured. Native stories characterize the conflict as harsh and swift. It wasn't merely a battle, but a total collapse. Tom Custer died in the final moments, most likely struck through the chest and head. His body was discovered among his brothers, Tom and Boston Custer. Almost every soldier under his command was killed. More than 200 men were wiped out completely. For the native warriors, it was a profound and emotional triumph, although it was not celebrated with loud rejoicing. Some accounts speak of mourning instead of cheers, an awareness that, Despite winning the fight, the war was far from over. The U.S. Army would come back, and this brief moment of victory would be answered with revenge. Nevertheless, for one day on Montana's rolling hills, the unstoppable force driving westward expansion faltered, and Custer, the daring leader seeking a legacy, found it not through conquest, but in total destruction. As evening descended on June 25th, silence returned to the hills of the Little Big Horn. Fires glowed faintly, scattered ammunition belts lay abandoned, and the land bore witness to the cost of that fateful day. 200 soldiers from the 7th Cavalry lay lifeless, including Tom Armstrong Custer, and nearly every officer under his immediate command. The battlefield was scattered with shattered weapons, fallen horses, and the remains of men caught completely unprepared. However, the indigenous victory, as thorough as it was, carried a somber realization. This did not mark the conclusion, rather, it ignited a spark. The U.S. government, both humiliated and furious, would refuse to ignore what they labeled as a massacre. Back in the East, newspapers shouted headlines about Custer's final stand, portraying him as a hero and the native fighters as ruthless attackers. The background, including treaty breaches, the rush for gold on sacred lands, and the defensive nature of the battle, was deliberately omitted from the national conversation. In the days that came next, Native families grieved their losses as well. Though triumphant, they had endured casualties too. They were fully aware the American response would be rapid. Certain leaders, among them Sitting Bull, encouraged swift action. They dismantled the large village and dispersed into smaller groups across the plains, readying themselves for the inevitable retaliation. It was not long before U.S. forces, better equipped and reinforced, arrived in the area. The defeat at Little Big Horn only strengthened Washington's determination. Policies grew more severe, treaties were disregarded. Additional soldiers came. The aim was no longer to negotiate, but to assert control. Eventually, Sitting Bull fled north. Canada managed to evade capture, while Crazy Horse persisted in fighting for an additional year before he died, under mysterious circumstances, in 1877. Numerous groups, starved and outmatched, were compelled to move onto reservations, losing their freedom entirely. The battlefield itself was located by rescue forces 2 days afterward. The sight they encountered was grim and unforgettable. Many soldiers had been stripped of their uniforms and gear, a customary practice among warriors meant to rob enemies of their honor. Some corpses showed signs of mutilation, while others remained untouched, according to tribal traditions and the severity of the combat. Yet there was no denying the outcome. Custer was no more. The 7th Cavalry had been devastated, and for a brief moment, native resistance had accomplished the unimaginable. They had triumphed. The clash at Little Big Horn was far more than a mere military engagement. It evolved into a powerful emblem, distorted and manipulated by history. For the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho peoples, it represented a rare and hard-fought victory against overwhelming forces. To the United States government and its citizens, it symbolized a disgrace that required immediate and ruthless revenge. Within the American collective mind, the story quickly became twisted. Custer was recast from a reckless glory seeker into a mournful hero. He became the courageous general who made a final stand. The complexity of his decisions, the arrogance of his strategies, and the unfairness of the United States incursion into treaty-protected territories were all buried beneath a wave of patriotic myth-making. The media portrayed the native triumph as a massacre, overlooking the reality that it was a defensive struggle on indigenous territory. However, within native societies, the encounter was remembered in a much different light. It stood as a symbol of solidarity, courage, and a prophecy coming true. The great gathering at the Little Big Horn marked a last brilliant moment of liberty before the oppressive era of reservation life took hold. For many people, the fight became a proud emblem of defiance and endurance. It demonstrated that the native inhabitants of the plains were not submissive casualties, but fierce protectors of their homeland. Still, the cost of this success was immediate and harsh. Within a few months, military operations escalated dramatically. The buffalo populations, already suffering severe losses, were intentionally hunted to destruction to eliminate the native food resources. Tribes faced unrelenting pursuit and pressure. By the year 1877, Crazy Horse had died. Sitting Bull managed to survive longer, but his life ended violently in 1890, just days before the Wounded Knee Massacre, a further sorrowful chapter in the suppression of native independence. Thus, the memory of Little Bighorn developed a dual nature, both inspiring and mournful. It revealed the brutality of United States territorial expansion, the betrayal of numerous commitments, and the fierce spirit of a people unwilling to be erased without resistance. Nowadays, the battlefield is preserved as a national monument. For a long time, it paid tribute solely to Custer and his soldiers. However, in recent years, additional memorials have been established to recognize the native warriors who fought valiantly and gave their lives on that ground, not as enemies, but as heroes safeguarding their native lands. The hills bear witness to both perspectives. The breeze carries the melodies of each side. And the heritage of Little Bighorn still resonates if you are ready to hear more than a single narrative of history. In the broad sweep of American history, the Battle of Little Bighorn shines as one of those uncommon occasions when the underestimated not only resisted, but triumphed. For one day in 1876, indigenous warriors stopped the advance of a powerful empire. Their victory was not achieved through superior numbers, technology, or wealth. They succeeded through bravery, solidarity, and an unwavering determination to defend their lifestyle. However, the sorrow of Little Bighorn lies in the fact that this triumph did not alter the final course of events. Instead, it merely postponed it. More than that, it hastened the conclusion. The shocking defeat of Custer sparked fury in Washington. Public sentiment grew harsher. Any existing empathy for Native concerns was overwhelmed by a tide of revenge and patriotism. Congress boosted military budgets. The assault on the Plains tribes intensified with merciless efficiency. Within a few years, the nomadic existence that shaped the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho cultures for generations vanished. The buffalo were almost wiped out. Reservations were divided. The land was split among settlers. The very hills that once echoed with the sound of hooves and battle cries fell silent. Yet Little Bighorn has not disappeared. Over time, it has been re-examined, reinterpreted, and embraced anew. For numerous Americans, it remains a powerful symbol. It began as a story of noble sacrifice. For many others, it slowly transformed into a symbol of unfairness, representing a country that broke its promise and labeled resistance as betrayal. Today, this location stands as one of the rare battlegrounds where both sides are honored, where the monuments do not all face the same way. For indigenous communities, the battle holds profound meaning, not as a starting point of defeat, but as the final magnificent stand of a free people. It was a moment when everything being stripped from them, land, liberty, respect, was defended with all the courage they had left. This memory remains sacred. For the rest of us, Little Bighorn presents a challenging yet essential lesson about authority, myth, and the price of conquest. It shows us that history is not always recounted by the victors. Sometimes it lies buried beneath, waiting to be uncovered. In the end, Tom may have earned the fame, but the fighters of Little Bighorn gained something far more enduring: the truth and the right to declare, "We existed and we resisted." The Forbidden City was not merely constructed, it was summoned into existence through vision, effort, and an intense desire for dominance. In the year 1406, the Yongle Emperor of the Ming Dynasty commanded the creation of a new imperial residence in Beijing, with the intention to relocate the capital from Nanjing. This would not be a typical palace. It was destined to become the core of the Chinese Empire, a fortified enclave within the city where no outsiders were permitted to enter. Unless called upon, and with no secrets remaining within its walls, everything was exposed. Over the course of 14 years, more than 1 million workers, artisans, and engineers dedicated themselves to this massive project. The supplies came from all parts of the empire. Golden Nanmu wood sourced from Sichuan, enormous marble stones transported across frozen rivers, and countless glazed roof tiles fired to perfection. Step by step, an empire's pride was constructed in stone. Upon completion, the Forbidden City spanned almost 180 acres and contained over 900 structures. Its design followed rigid Confucian ideals, balanced, organized, and hierarchical. At its center stood the Hall of Supreme Harmony, where emperors were crowned and official orders echoed through the administration. Yet beyond its magnificence, the true intention was psychological. This was not merely a home, but a symbol. The emperor does not dwell among you, he resides above you. And indeed, access was strictly barred. Ordinary residents of Beijing never entered. Even top officials could come only with imperial approval. Guards manned every entrance. Spies watched every hallway. Outside the city walls, markets thrived with everyday life. Inside, however, time slowed, and ceremony dominated. It formed a realm bound by ritual veiled in secrecy and separated from the chaos of ordinary existence. Still beneath its gleaming roofs and red pillars, the Forbidden City also functioned like a pressure cooker. Despite its stunning appearance, it was constructed to isolate, to centralize authority, and protect the emperor from dangers both physical and political. Over time, this place transformed into a hub of scheming, betrayal, and whispered secrets. It was a palace in form, but also a stage for 5 centuries of empire, ambition, and gradual decline. From the exterior, it sparkled with grandeur. From within, it observed silently and never forgot those who walked its corridors. At the core of this restricted city sat the emperor, the Son of Heaven, the living link between the mortal world and the divine. Yet, despite his immense cosmic power, the man ruling the throne often endured a life of deep loneliness. The Forbidden City did more than guard the emperor. It engulfed him. Each day of his existence followed a rigorously planned script. He awoke to music, was dressed by attendants, and adhered to a routine so formal it felt like theater. Every meal was tested for poison. Ministers read documents aloud while kneeling before him. Even a simple walk in the gardens required official permission and multiple escorts. Nothing happened by chance. Everything was under scrutiny. Though the emperor occupied the highest position in the hierarchy, he was anything but free. The very system that placed him on the pinnacle also trapped him. Surrounded by layers of eunuchs, ministers, consorts, and informants, he seldom encountered the outside world directly. The information he received was filtered, and his social contacts tightly controlled. His freedom to act independently was severely limited. In later dynasties, the ability of emperors to act independently was frequently suppressed by the overwhelming system of court protocols. Some rulers managed this with harsh decisiveness, like Yonga or Kangxi, who governed firmly and expertly controlled the bureaucracy. Others fell into suspicion, moral decay, or detachment, becoming trapped within their own palaces like golden phantoms. Certain emperors spent many months or even years inside the Forbidden City without ever stepping beyond its walls. The realm they ruled seemed as distant as the moon. Even inside the palace, access to the emperor was strictly regulated. Senior officials sometimes waited for days just to gain an audience. Family members had very limited interactions, and woe to the servant who crossed forbidden boundaries. Court rules dictated where one stood, how to bow, and even what one was permitted to see. In theory, the emperor could command vast armies with a single word. Yet, in reality, he often struggled to figure out whom to trust or what truths lay beyond his palace walls. The throne might have been sculpted from jade and raised above dragons, but it was also encased in veils, countless layers of secrecy and ritual. The Forbidden City crowned its ruler in golden splendor, but it also wrapped him in silence. Behind each throne inside this immense palace stood a hidden force, not generals or ministers, but eunuchs, castrated men who served within the palace. Originally lowly servants, eunuchs gradually transformed into some of the most influential figures. One of the most influential and dreaded figures in imperial China held a unique position. In a society where women were confined and men were often dangers, Eunuchs occupied an unusual role, close to the emperor yet politically significant, because they could never produce competing dynasties. Initially, their responsibilities were straightforward, such as overseeing palace tasks, conveying messages, and maintaining the emperor's robes. However, as emperors withdrew more from public life, especially during the Ming and Qing eras, eunuchs began to fill the power gap. They regulated access to the emperor, controlled the flow of information, and eventually assumed full control over administrative duties. Some eunuchs achieved greater influence than military leaders. Others had the emperor's confidence in ways even his own relatives lacked. With such authority came desire and corruption. The history of eunuchs inside the Forbidden City is a story of ascent and downfall. For every devoted servant, there was someone scheming to manipulate imperial decisions, silence rivals, and accumulate riches. Certain eunuchs, such as Jack Xian during the late Ming period, effectively governed the entire empire behind concealed screens. His adversaries vanished, his supporters gained promotion, and entire government departments feared his influence. The impact of eunuchs extended beyond politics. They nurtured the emperor from childhood, observed his development, and frequently acted as fathers, advisors, or enablers. Their presence was unceasing within the emperor's living quarters, study, and court. If the emperor felt isolated, it was often due to those closest around him. Often, the eunuchs were the only ones who truly understood and sometimes took advantage of that isolation. Still, their existence was far from comfortable. Many were forcibly castrated during childhood, usually coming from impoverished families with the hope of securing a future within the palace walls. Those who lived through the harsh procedure and endured years of menial tasks could, with cleverness and fortune, advance in status. However, Confucian scholars and military leaders always regarded them with distrust. They were tolerated and utilized, but often blamed when problems arose. In a city founded on ritual and secrecy, the eunuchs were the quiet forces moving the pieces. They were not rulers, not mere pawns, but something far more complex and far more perilous. Beyond the impressive halls and imposing gates of the Forbidden City lay its most hidden section, the inner court. This was the emperor's private domain, a labyrinth of palaces, gardens, and bedchambers concealed behind the crimson walls. In this place, governance gave way to matters of the dynasty, including consorts, concubines, and offspring. Here, political maneuvering became more personal and intense, governed by beauty, envy, and lineage. The inner court was split into 3 principal palaces reserved for the emperor and 6 residences meant for the empress and concubines. But the calm-sounding names and fragrant gardens should not deceive anyone. This was no tranquil refuge. It was a battleground where dozens, sometimes hundreds of women vied for favor. The inner court was a place of fierce competition and hidden dangers, a realm filled with hidden threats, quiet pacts, and carefully planned ambitions. At the summit stood the empress, the lawful spouse of the emperor. She carried rank and ceremony, but did not always enjoy his love. The emperor's heart and heirs frequently came from concubines whose standing could change abruptly, shaped by a look, a pregnancy, or a solitary rumor. Some gave birth to sons and rose to power. Others slipped into oblivion, their names erased, their destinies quietly forgotten. Palace maids and senior eunuchs served as go-betweens, messengers, and sometimes secret agents. Nothing passed unnoticed. Nothing was left unremembered. The women in the court had limited liberties but exercised influence through charm, cunning, and occasionally poison. Sometimes a consort's favor grew so strong she effectively ruled through the emperor himself. One of the most renowned was Empress Daja Cixi, who climbed from a low-ranking concubine to become the de facto ruler of China for close to 50 years. Her authority started within these very walls, behind shut doors, clothed in silken robes, armed with a sharp mind and immense patience. To the outside world, the inner court seemed quiet and fragrant, a space of art, music, and elegance. But behind latticed windows and painted screens, it was a crucible where status, survival, and heritage clashed. In the Forbidden City, power did not only parade in boots and robes. At times it moved quietly along moonlit hallways in embroidered garments, slippers softly tapping, wearing a gentle smile, ready to make a move. Within the Forbidden City, each action carried significance. Every step taken, every bow performed, every incense offering mattered. Nothing was left to chance. This place was not simply a palace. It functioned like a divine mechanism. The emperor was not merely a man. He represented the Son of Heaven, acting as the connection between the mortal realm and the divine. This meant all his actions bore a cosmic importance. It was not only about authority. It was about maintaining universal balance and order. Each morning, officials gathered by the Meridian Gate well before dawn, patiently awaiting the morning court session. These meetings were brief but meticulously organized. Ministers knelt, responded only when addressed, and presented their reports with rehearsed modesty. Outside the walls, they held significant power. Inside the palace, they became shadows, standing humbly at the emperor's feet. One of the most magnificent ceremonies took place during the winter solstice, when the emperor made offerings at the Temple of Heaven to preserve harmony between the sky and the earth. These rituals were essential and carried political significance on a sacred scale. Any mistake, adverse weather, or missed step was interpreted as a warning that the heavenly mandate could be faltering. Within the palace, rituals shaped every aspect of existence: weddings, funerals, births, even dining rituals. The emperor's meals were scrutinized by numerous officials, tasted for poison, and arranged according to strict customs. Should the emperor alter the menu without approval, disorder could ensue, threatening the delicate cosmic order. Echoing through both kitchens and courts, the atmosphere was undeniably heavy. Yet perhaps the most revealing custom was the silence itself. One never spoke to the emperor unless he first addressed you. Eye contact was forbidden. Even his closest relatives would bow, rise, and retreat, walking backwards. Physical distance was a strict rule. Close familiarity was seldom allowed. Over the years, the fixation on ceremony became both a protector and a constraint. On one side, it ensured continuity, order, and legitimacy for countless generations. On the opposite side, it stifled decision-making. Officials argued endlessly about rules while the outside world evolved rapidly. Foreign nations grew stronger, and revolutions lurked nearby. Yet within the Forbidden City, ministers still debated the exact count of ritual steps required for a royal parade. The traditions that secured power gradually turned it into rigidity. They maintained the empire's existence, but trapped it in place, like a stunningly decorated clock whose hands no longer moved forward. Inside that gilded fortress, the grand act proceeded, immaculate, precise, but increasingly out of touch. Beneath the varnished beams and shimmering tiles of the Forbidden City lay a realm unseen in portraits, a domain filled with shadows, murmurs, and constant distrust. While the walls repelled external foes, they could never fully restrain internal ambition. In a palace built on concentrated, inherited, and precarious power, the greatest threats were not invading armies at the gates. They came in the form of servants within your private quarters. Espionage was more than common. It was built into the system. Every servant reported to another, creating a network of palace surveillance. Servants exchanged secrets in hushed, coded tones. Even the emperor's concubines had their own informants who bribed or blackmailed lower-ranking servants to gather intelligence on their rivals. The emperor's decree was absolute, yet often he struggled to discern which words were truthful. Suspicion was a daily companion. Letters were intercepted and read. Conversations were secretly listened to. A casual comment could be distorted into an accusation of treason. Baseless allegations spread rapidly. Officials could rise to greatness one day and be banished the next, all based on whispered rumors. Entire families vanished during the night. Some chose to end their own lives rather than face trial, fully aware of the grim outcomes that awaited them if they resisted. The eunuchs operated as both players and enforcers in this hidden conflict. While some remained loyal guards protecting the emperor, others constructed expansive spy networks that rivaled any secret service. During the Ming Dynasty, a dreaded intelligence agency known as the Eastern Depot, run by the eunuchs, wielded fearsome authority. They held the power to arrest, interrogate, and execute people without seeking approval from the civil administration. Torture was routine. Confessions were extracted painfully and forcibly. Although court scholars and officials despised the eunuchs' dominion, they were not innocent of scheming either. The palace was like a chessboard, with every appointment, marriage alliance, and imperial decree serving as a strategic move in an endless power game. Occasionally, the emperor himself became a mere pawn, especially if he was young, frail, or uninterested in ruling. Regents and dowagers controlled affairs, offering kind smiles in daylight but striking in darkness. In this realm, achievement required silence, shrewdness, and a flawless recollection of alliances. A single mistake, even a fleeting glance, might prove deadly. Nevertheless, people continued to plot, because within the Forbidden City, nothing was more valuable than being near the throne, and nothing more devastating than losing that position. Beneath the ceremonies and scarlet walls, this city never truly rested. It constantly observed and anticipated. Though the Forbidden City appeared immortal, with its golden rooftops shimmering under the sun and its crimson walls untouched by time, inside, empires emerged and vanished with unsettling speed. Authority that seemed divine from afar often revealed itself as perilously fragile when examined closely. Sometimes the downfall of an empire did not occur on a battlefield, but in a silent hallway, behind a sealed door, fading away through whispered secrets shared by those closest to power. The Ming dynasty, responsible for constructing the Forbidden City, governed for nearly 300 years. Yet, by the 17th century, it struggled under the burden of excessive bureaucracy, rampant corruption within, and peasant rebellions. The palace transformed into a labyrinth of ceremonial fixations and centralized control, while famine and turmoil grew beyond its walls. In the year 1644, as insurgent forces neared Beijing, the last Ming ruler ended his life in the palace gardens. He left behind a note expressing sorrow over his defeat and a palace vulnerable to conquest. The Manchus, a foreign power from the northeast, advanced swiftly and initiated the Qing dynasty. Remarkably, they decided to preserve the Forbidden City served as the center of authority, preserving its customs while integrating new influences. The structure itself stayed intact, yet the spoken language, attire, and ceremonies gradually changed. Once more, the red walls absorbed the upheaval and maintained the appearance of unbroken tradition. The Qing dynasty governed from the Forbidden City for an additional 268 years, experiencing times of wealth as well as catastrophic decline. During the 19th century, the later Qing rulers faced significant difficulties adjusting to emerging modern challenges. Western imperial ambitions, domestic uprisings, and lack of technological progress all played a part. During this turbulent period, Empress Dowager Cixi held power behind the scenes, effectively controlling court affairs, while she resisted changes that might have preserved the empire's stability. When the young Emperor Puyi took the throne in 1908, the Forbidden City resembled more a historical exhibit than a seat of real authority. With the fall of the Qing dynasty in 1912, an era of more than 2,000 years of imperial dominance came to an end. Interestingly, Puyi was permitted to stay within the Forbidden City for another 13 years, like a specter roaming through the remnants of his former life. Although the emperors had disappeared, the palace endured, empty yet grand, and filled with the lingering presence of vanished reigns. The fortress walls stood firm, but the rulers inside were no longer there. After 1912, when the Qing dynasty collapsed, the Forbidden City might have slipped into silence. Instead, it embarked on one of the most unusual episodes among its 5 centuries of existence. The monarchy had vanished, and China had become a republic. Yet, within its walls, a remarkable story continued to unfold. Within the crimson walls, a child emperor lingered. Tom, only 6 years old, still clad in dragon robes, continued to perform empty rituals and yet ruled over nothing. This strange situation resulted from a political compromise. The newly established Republican government permitted Tom to stay within the inner court of the Forbidden City, isolated from the rapidly evolving streets of Beijing. Beyond the palace, warlords clashed fiercely for control as revolution remade society. Inside, however, it was as if time had frozen. The eunuchs remained faithful to their duties. Meals were presented with ceremonial precision. The emperor awoke, dressed, and was shown reverence. He was a ruler without a realm, a boy trapped inside a dream that had already broken. But Tom was not unaware. As he matured, he started questioning the world surrounding him. He secretly read newspapers brought into the palace. He witnessed airplanes soaring overhead. The energy of modern life stirred beyond his gates while he resided in a fading museum of past glory. And deep down, he understood, even though none dared say it aloud, that the empire was indeed finished. His seclusion bred a mixture of bitterness, curiosity, and eventually rebellion. In the year 1923, a great fire erupted within the palace. This suspicious blaze destroyed invaluable artifacts. Tom accused the eunuchs of theft and deliberate destruction, and in retaliation, he expelled hundreds of them. Centuries of palace customs disappeared overnight. The Forbidden City began to empty. By 1924, a warlord called Jack Fang finally forced Tom out of the palace. The emperor, now a young man, was escorted away from the place he once ruled. Through the very gates where emperors had ruled for centuries, Tom was carried in a rickshaw. There was no throne awaiting him, no ceremonial guard by his side, only a displaced figure wrapped in the fading echoes of lost authority. Yet Tom's journey did not stop there. Later, he collaborated with the Japanese, becoming a puppet leader in Manchuria. Eventually, he was captured, imprisoned, and subjected to re-education by the communist government. In his final days, he found peace working as a gardener, nurturing flowers in Beijing, living quietly not far from the palace that once defined his entire existence. Tom was the last resident of the Forbidden City, and when he departed, he carried the empire's final breath along with him. Today, the Forbidden City no longer conceals its mysteries, but openly reveals them. What was once closed to almost the entire nation is now accessible to millions. Renamed the Palace Museum, it stands as a symbol not only of imperial splendor, but also of the complex layers of history, power struggles, and cultural identity that shaped a vast civilization. Walking through its gates today, visitors pass beneath the same towering red walls that once intimidated foreign envoys and echoed with the steps of ancient rulers. The golden roofs still sparkle under the sunlight, and the dragon decorations remain as majestic as ever. However, instead of guards and noble courtiers, tourists, selfie sticks, and schoolchildren with notebooks fill the halls. The Forbidden City now protects over 1,800,000 artifacts, including scrolls, paintings, porcelain, ceremonial robes, weapons, and countless treasures that continue to tell the story of a magnificent empire. The personal possessions of emperors and empresses hold a unique fascination. Yet, beyond these artifacts, what resonates most profoundly is the silence within chambers that once steered the destiny of millions. Vacant thrones, shut doors, and expansive courtyards convey tales far more compelling than any descriptive plaque. Careful restoration has preserved the complex in exceptional condition. However, the Forbidden City is not only conserved, it has been reinvented. It stands today as a vibrant museum, a symbol of national pride, and intriguingly, a site where the legacy of autocracy has been repurposed to educate the public. The irony is unmistakable. A palace originally designed to bar entry has evolved into one of the planet's most frequented destinations. Nevertheless, beneath the buzz of visitors and the constant flash of cameras, the profound significance of the location endures. You experience it first in the Hall of Supreme Harmony, where emperors once towered above a submissive court. You sense it in the cool passageways of the inner court, where hushed conversations once shaped fates. And you perceive it in the gardens, a place where solitary rulers wandered among stone artworks, yearning for a reality that remained out of reach. In many aspects, the Forbidden City acts as a mirror, reflecting China's magnificence, authority, fragility, and resilience. It is more than a historical remnant. It provides a structure for grasping how history influences today. From isolation to upheaval to collective remembrance, it has witnessed every era and continues to observe, not as a power center now, but as a silent witness to all that transpired after the empire's final exhale.